I am very excited to bring to you the South Carolina State Standards Review. We're going to start with World War I. This will kind of narrow down your focus, so if you are looking to take the South Carolina end of course exam for U.S. history, these sets of videos will help you. So starting with World War I, there are some things that you need to be familiar with, and one of the things that you need to be familiar with is the causes of World War I. And the easiest way to remember the causes of World War I are that there are four main causes: militarism, secret alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. We're not going to do these in order because it doesn't make sense to do them in order. The first one we want to talk about is nationalism, and to understand what nationalism is, you need to be familiar with what is a nation. A nation is simply a group of people that share something in common. Usually it's language or religion or ethnicity, culture. They can share a shared history. Of course, right now it's the 21st of June 2014, and we've got, if you're watching the news, can watch the Middle East and see all these different groups of people fighting. And the Middle East is a great example of a place full of different nationalities, full of different nations, but they don't have their own country or they don't have their own state. So you can sort of think of that's what Europe looked like before World War I, with one exception. You had all these different nations that were ruled by larger empires, right? You've got Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia. So really big empires sort of controlling and ruling these smaller nations inside. So it's important to 1A, understand what a nation is, and understand that nations don't always have their own country or their own state. This map sort of shows you, before World War I, the different languages that existed across Europe. So you've got Romanian, Hungarian, Serbian, Croatian. But who's ruling these different groups? These countries. These are your main countries, your main empires. So you've got Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Italy. So these countries are really starting to develop a very, very strong sense of nationalism. They start conquering these different smaller nations in their borders, but they want to incorporate them and make them feel sort of patriotic about being British, even though they might not necessarily be British. But they are definitely building a sense of nationalism, which basically means a pride in their nation, a pride in their country. And to do this, they start expanding, and the word for this sort of expansion during this time period, of course, is imperialism. And you need to be familiar with imperialism because these countries are not just expanding on the European continent, they're going into Africa and they're going into Asia. So if you look at this map, you can see that Great Britain, which of course was the country where the sun never set, it's going to have influence in Africa, Canada, India, Australia. All of the countries were all of the main empires or your main countries were expanding all across the globe in an effort to increase their status. Well, how do you do this? How do you maintain order over all these different groups? You have to build a military. And so that's when this militarism comes into play. They have to control these different areas. So European military expenditure is going to go way up during this time period. Between 1900 and 1914 is going to see sort of an arms race. So in 1870, the combined military expenditure of the six great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Italy, totaled about 94 million pounds. By 1914, it's going to quadruple to 398 million pounds. Twofold. They've got to sort of keep all these different groups, all these different nations under control. And as they start building up their military to do this, the countries or their neighbors are going to want to meet that, right? So like if Britain is building up its navy, France might start building up its army. And if France starts building its army, then Germany is going to start building their army. So you have an arms race that starts. And that's going to be the military cause for World War I. So the last of the four that we want to look at is secret alliances. Maybe you've watched the television show Survivor, and everybody's sort of talking behind everybody's back and trying to get with this person to further their interest. You can think of it as the same thing, but with countries. So for example, Russia. Russia has some ethnic connection. Some of them speak the same language with Serbia. So Russia's going to align itself secretly with Serbia. Germany and Austria are going to secretly align. Of course, they share a border. France and Russia are going to align. Britain and France and Belgium, and then Japan and Britain. But keep in mind that while they're allying with people that they think have a common interest or might protect them in some way or benefit them in some way, they are not advertising this alliance to the other countries. And that's going to pose a problem. So we've all these big nations sort of flaunting their stuff, expanding through imperialism to protect their borders. They start building up a military, and then they start secretly aligning themselves. This map is showing you how the countries are going to align themselves. You don't necessarily have to, for the exam, remember who's aligned with who or the central the Entente and stuff like that. But when we look at some going forwards, World War I, it's helpful to have this idea of who is on whose side. The yellow is going to be the Allies, and the Central Powers are going to be in blue. Some nations did manage to stay neutral. All right, so those are your four main causes that you need to be familiar with. And they sort of, if you think about what a nation is and and strong pride in your nation and expansion, and then how do you keep that expansion, keep all those different nations under control, and then you need to align yourself with other people. So it is progressive and it does sort of make sense. So you've got this problem. Historians like to refer to this as a powder keg, and you might see that as a term. What was the match that lit the powder keg in Europe, or lit the powder keg for World War I? And basically it just means that all of this was under control, but one thing could set it off. What was the spark that lit the powder keg? Well, it's going to be the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and you do need to know him. He's important. Because if he hadn't died, all the dominoes might not have fallen the way they were. But he was assassinated by Serbia. Now remember, Serbia is that nation that's being ruled by Austria-Hungary. They don't want to be ruled by Austria-Hungary, so they assassinate the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne. So now if you think back to, well, who's aligned with Serbia? Russia, right? So you have to remember that Russia is going to support Serbia. So Austria-Hungary wants to declare war on Serbia, but what they don't know is that by declaring war on Serbia, they're also declaring war on Russia. Well, who's Russia's ally? France. So this causes a huge problem. This slide just basically outlines who is aligned with who and how it's going to pull everybody into the war. So Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Germany is allied with Austria-Hungary. Russia is allied with Serbia. Britain and France are allied with Russia. There is some debate that Austria-Hungary was willing to negotiate with Serbia, but that Germany sort of pushed Austria-Hungary to declare war. And that's going to be one reason that a lot of the blame was placed on Germany at the end of the war, because they sort of pushed for Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia. So when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, all the allies are pulled into the war. But what does this have to do with America, right? So Europe is engulfed in this war, but it is across the ocean. So America doesn't really want to be involved. We want to remain neutral, but we do trade with Europe, right? We've got trade agreements with both Great Britain and Germany. Again, this is why you need to know who's on what side, because Great Britain and Germany are on opposing sides, right? The key question here is, can you be neutral when you're trading with both sides? The argument can be debated that absolutely not, right? So Great Britain is blockading German ports, right? That's part of their war strategy, is to not let items get into Germany. So us being a neutral party, well, what's going to happen? Well, we're not going to trade with Germany because we don't want to get in, they're blockading the ports, but we do trade with Great Britain, providing them with more supplies. So it's very difficult to be neutral and trade with both sides in a war. So what's going to happen? Germany obviously needs supplies. They don't like the fact that America is trading more with Great Britain, so they're going to start bombing our neutral ships. And this bombing is called unrestricted submarine warfare. And that's also important. That's, highlight that in your notes, unrestricted. And when I say bombing during World War I, I'm not referring to bombs dropping from the air. Bombing in World War I is coming from submarines, right? So we're not going to go into detail about the different submarines. If you want to do that, you can definitely look at it. So unrestricted submarine warfare is going to lead to the sinking of the Lusitania. And here's where students get into a little bit of trouble. The question says, what was the cause of America entering World War I? And students immediately circle the sinking of the Lusitania. No. How do I know this? We didn't enter the war until 2 years later. So, yes, the sinking of the Lusitania was horrific. Thousands of people, Americans, civilians died. It did make America angry. We thought about getting involved. But Woodrow Wilson, who's president during this time, is going to negotiate with Germany, and Germany's going to stop unrestricted warfare. Okay, so just bombing ships willy-nilly. He's going to campaign in 1916, which is after the sinking of the Lusitania, on he kept us out of war. And that's very important to Americans. They don't want to be dragged into this war, and Wilson knew it. So he gets reelected in 1916. A year later, he's going to go to Congress, because remember, Congress is the body that declares war, not the president, and he makes the case for going to war. So what happened between 1916 and 1917 to change his mind? The Zimmerman telegram. And the Zimmerman telegram is just crazy. And you really have to read it. So I'm just going to read it to you. We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. So who do you think this is from? Well, obviously this is from Germany. Remember, we're going to begin again unrestricted warfare. This is to Mexico. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event that this does not succeed, we make Mexico a proposal for an alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement and development is left to you. You will inform the President of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan immediately adherence, and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. Please call the President's attention to the fact that the ruthless employment of our submarines now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace. So take a few moments just to think about that. What are some of the things that really have changed between 1916 and then now? Well, two things. One, they're going to begin bombing our ships again, and they are saying that it's going to be ruthless. Yes, Germany, of course, does not want to drag America into the war, but they're sort of expecting it. So they send this letter to Mexico hoping for an alliance so that Mexico would come into America and take back these territories. So with this, Wilson's going to go to Congress and say we can no longer be neutral. He's going to argue also to the American spirit for democracy. Of course, you have to, it's a stretch, and you have to understand the countries that are at war again, remembering who's on what side. The Central Powers are Germany, Austria, and Austria-Hungary. Now, they are monarchs. They're not democratic. They don't have elections. The Allies, which are going to be France and Great Britain, are democratic. We are much closer to them. So if the Central Powers were to win and take over France and Great Britain, that means that America would be the last standing nation with a democratic government. So he makes this compelling argument that not only do we need to do this because they're gonna maybe align themselves with Mexico and pull us in anyways, but we also need to do this to protect democracy. So you need to understand unrestricted warfare by Germany. It's going to get being renewed. The Zimmerman telegram obviously is going to pull us into the war, and then he's going to make Wilson's going to make the argument that we need to do it to protect democracy. America, of course, we're never very fond of getting involved in wars, especially in European wars. So Wilson does have to go on a propaganda campaign to encourage Americans to get on board. Posters characterizing Germans as complete baboons and horrible gorillas, and in movies you're going to see all sorts of push that there's an evil German empire taking over and we have to protect democracy or we'll end up being taken over. Propaganda is, if you see, it might ask you, well, what is the definition of propaganda, or what is propaganda? And propaganda can be for good or it can be for bad, but basically it's an exaggeration of something to try to convince people to do something. So for example, we want people to buy bonds. So you're going to exaggerate the horror of the enemy, with the example of like the shoe coming down on the German army to encourage you to buy bonds. There's during this time period, there's going to be a shortage of food because farmers are going to start producing a lot of food to send to Europe, and Americans are going to have to try to cut back, and to do this you're going to have posters that are encouraging you through propaganda. Another thing they did during the war to help encourage unification and support for the war was they passed the Sedition Act of 1918. And basically it prevented people from protesting. You couldn't talk against the war, you couldn't talk against the country, against the flag. They really wanted to keep people behind the war effort. Of course, this is severe limitations on your First Amendment rights to free speech and freedom of the press, but it was seen as necessary because we were at war. Wilson's 14 points are very important, and of course they are going to show up in some form on your end of course exam. Wilson's 14 points are his ideas for peace after the war, and we're going to divide them up into 3. So let's look at the first 5. The first 5 things that he thinks is important to happen after the war to maintain peace is there should be no more secret alliances, free navigation of the seas, an end to all economic barriers between countries, countries have to reduce their weapons, and all decisions regarding the colonies should be impartial. So you can see the first 5 are referring directly back to those causes we talked about, right? Imperialism has to do with colonies, and freedom of the seas has to do with huge amounts of military, and of course reducing weapons has to do with that militarism. So you have to understand those causes so that you can then understand Wilson's first 14 points. 6 through 13 are going to be dealing with how to redraw the map in Europe, and that goes back to, well, what is a nation, right? That nationalism, and who should have a state, and who should have their country, and who rules it. So that's why it's really important to understand, well, what is a nation? And you can read through the 6 through 13. Now 14, of course, if you're going to pick the most important, well, the most important to Wilson would be 14. He believes strongly that there should be a League of Nations. Please remember League of Nations. Don't get that confused with United Nations. This is your league. And he believed that the League of Nations should be a group, all the countries coming together to talk about and work on keeping peace, and it should be very diplomatic. Part of the problem with the League of Nations, of course, is going to be that it wasn't very effective. It was very weak. Everybody had a voice and everybody had to agree. Well, I can't even agree with, I've got 3 brothers, I can't agree with 2 of them. So you can imagine if you've got world leaders in a room, how effective getting everyone to agree to something is going to be. But he strongly believed in it. That's going to be his baby. So America gets involved, we support the Allies, and we win the war. At the end of the war, the treaty is called the Treaty of Versailles. And of course, it's signed in France, in the big, in Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors, and I'm trying to think of how you could remember Treaty of Versailles, but you just have to remember that Versailles is in France. It's a huge, beautiful palace. If you ever get the chance to go to Paris, you can go and see it. So what are some of the provisions at the end of the war? And this is important because Wilson is going to have the ability to have a say in what goes into the Treaty of Versailles. And this sort of is the first time that America is going to be able to get involved in European affairs directly. The big 4 who signed the Treaty of France are going to be Great Britain, Italy. Treaty of Versailles is going to be Great Britain, Italy, France, and the United States. So who's left out? Germany. And this is important because they're going to want to punish Germany, and they're going to set very, very harsh punishments for Germany for starting the war so that they don't do it again. Of course, we talked about the League of Nations and how it was Wilson's baby, and how it's going to cause America to be able to participate in European affairs. But America doesn't want to be involved in European affairs. This was a horrible war. Thousands and thousands of people died. This was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and the American people didn't want to be involved in another one, and they saw the League of Nations as further entangling us in European affairs. So if Europe goes to war, we would then have to go to war too, when maybe we could just stay out of it if we weren't involved. So we are not going to join the League of Nations. And that was, and then the people that kept us from doing that was the Senate. So you have to remember that the Senate was the one that said, no, we're not going to do that, even though the American people also did not believe in it. And the American people did not believe in the Treaty of Versailles, and we actually never ratified or signed the Treaty of Versailles either. So if you remember, this is going back to nationalism and what is a nation. With the Treaty of Versailles, you're going to get 9 new countries. So you can see that they divided up Austria-Hungary. They created these new countries based on nationalism. Maybe it was their language or a shared culture, a shared heritage. But they really tried to create states, not huge empires. Here again, we're going back to the League of Nations. When America didn't join the League of Nations, you do need to remember that that weakened the League of Nations considerably. It's going to fail to stop Japan from invading China, and of course, when Hitler starts taking over Germany, the League of Nations doesn't stop that either. So when we don't join, it's very weak, and we sort of talked about that. All right, the last thing we want to look at for the Treaty of Versailles and for World War I is what did the Treaty of Versailles do to Germany? And that's going to be important because later when we study World War II, you have to understand the harshness of the treaty to Germany. Germany is going to lose 13% of its territory, so it's severely shrunk it down because they don't want Germany to be big and powerful and come back and start a war again. We'll see how well that worked. All the German colonies are going to be given to other countries. The border between France and Germany is going to be demilitarized. The military is going to get slashed. They don't want them to have an air force, and they're going to take away their tanks. The big thing is going to be that Germany is going to have to pay reparations, and you need to understand or remember that reparations is money given to the countries they harmed. So Germany has to pay France and pay Great Britain for all the casualties that they caused. The number was huge, and they knew that Germany was not going to be able to pay it back, but they did it anyways because this treaty really was looking to punish Germany for the war and sort of say, you know, don't do this again. But we're going to look at later when we study World War II that this crippling of the country actually led to a war. All right, so that's what you need to know for World War I. Of course, we left out a great deal. You could study many other different things about World War I, but for the purposes of a U.S. history class, these are the important facts that you need. Of course, when I'm putting this together, I had to read many, many sources, and if any of these you may want to look at for further information, of course.